Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. This is the Transitional Primates podcast where we are interviewing Erika, also calls her channel for some reason Gutsick Gibbon.
Fair enough. Yeah. Yep. I'm here. I'm ready to talk primates.
Right.
Yes.
Tell the dear. Go ahead.
Yeah, and of course, this is me, Mr. Brass, and it's good to have Erika on. We actually, well, at least for me, I don't know about my friend here, but I first learned about you from your debate with Kent Hovind.
Yeah. That's
standing for truth.
been a general theme, for better or worse, I suppose.
So at least Kent Hovind served some good purpose.
Yeah, Kent can serve as quite the cautionary tale, I think, for many people who are just kind of getting involved in the scene of looking at sort of the differences between a young Earth creationist worldview and, some what I would consider a bit of common sense. That said, I think that it's good. It's good to engage people like Kent, not for Kent's purposes, not for the benefit of Kent, but for the benefit of people who can watch from the outside and kind of see how that logic runs and how it runs out.
Well, tell the dear audience about yourself. What got you interested in the world before humans, and tell us all about yourself.
Oh man, you got to be careful letting me monologue like that. I'll go on for days. Well, let's see. I've got my undergraduate education at the University of Arkansas. When I was there, I was originally going for pre-veterinary purposes, so I went ahead and made my major animal science. But then I ended up going on a trip. My summer of my freshman year, it was titled Ecology and Evolution. In Tanzania. So we had the utmost pleasure of touring Tanzania for about a month. And while we were there, because it was human evolution and also the ecology of the African savanna, we got to visit places like Olduvai Gorge, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's super, super famous location. Anthropologically, it was where, Homo habilis was found. I believe quite close in the Afar region is where we find a lot of our Australopithecines, but definitely genus Homo, and golly, I think even a couple of specimens of sort of Erectus are still hanging around in that area. And just standing there in that gorge, it looks completely barren, but it didn't used to be that way. As you know, things are constantly changing, especially in the East African Rift Valley. So it used to be quite a bit lusher back when our ancestors lived there. And being there and just seeing, I mean, you can literally bend down and pick fossils out of the ground, like any common stone. There are hand axes every 5 feet. So it was definitely a popular dwelling place and very humbling indeed. And so that kind of sparked my interest in anthropology, biological anthropology in general. And then later in the trip, we got to go to Gombe Stream National Park, which is where Jane Goodall does her research, and sort of where we kind of first learned about one of our closest living relatives, the common chimpanzee, so Pan troglodytes. And we got to actually follow them through the forest. We got to see the alpha male. At the time it was Ferdinand, but I believe it's changed since then. And follow sort of the G group as they went about their daily activities. And I've got this visceral experience in my head of getting too close to one of the females, and she had an infant on her chest. And I got too close, and she kind of turned and looked at me, and it sounds quite silly, but when we made eye contact, it was almost this expression of, "What are you doing here? You don't belong here." And I was like, "Holy cow! Like there is some serious intelligence lurking back there, and it's a familiar intelligence." So when I went back, after that trip, I was like, I've got to get more. I got to have more. So I ended up picking up a minor in anthropology, and then just kind of incidentally in biology as well. And I was kind of like, well, what do I do now? I guess I'll go get my master's, but what should I get it in? And I had this opportunity to apply for this sort of master's of research program here in London, which is essentially just it's a mini PhD kind of is what they kind of call it, because it is a master's, but it's in research, so it's very heavily centered on going out, structuring a project or a study rather, and then collecting that data, and it's in primatology, so it kind of mishmashes my love of animals in general and my love of anthropology and studying our order of primates. So that's pretty much my deal, how I got into it, why I'm here today. And I just kind of hope to keep traversing this path, maybe grab a PhD, just casually pick one up here in a couple of years if I can. But I'm loving it. It's really cool stuff.
I can tell you're immersed in the
Well,
cognition of apes. Like, what amazing facts can you tell us about that?
Oh my God. Well, what do you want to know? Pick a species.
Considering that dolphins and even dogs have personalities, it would stand to reason that our primate cousins were very intelligent. But I'm immediately skeptical of sensational news such as bonobos and chimps having moral, ethical frameworks like we do, rather than social instincts.
Sure, it's morality tends to be something that people bring up quite often when considering human evolution, because the question is, where did it come from, and why is it here? And generally speaking, because we are a social species, and this is mirrored in bonobos and in chimps, albeit in different ways, but because we're so social, our entire livelihood rests on us kind of getting along with one another, because we're group living animals, and that's kind of what makes primates so unique, at least in a general context, is that many of us, in fact the vast majority, live in large groups, and we also have large brains. And with those two things in tandem, you get these interesting complex social structures that you don't see in other animals that live in groups, like say antelope, or lions or things like that. It's unmatched. So when people have questions about, okay, well, what is morality? Where does it come from? Well, it's sort of, at least as far as I know and what I've looked into this, and I'm certainly not an expert, but it seems to be somewhat of a consequence of our social living, in that if you do things that don't rest well with the group, so say we would all agree that killing is immoral as a general kind of statement. Obviously, there are exceptions, self-defense, things like this. But we would go ahead and say that killing is immoral. Well, of course, it upsets social cohesion, and it puts the whole group at risk when social cohesion isn't going well. Not to mention the fact that, let's say, in both chimpanzee and bonobo society, kin is key. So if I go after one of your relatives, you and your entire line are probably going to come after me and mine. Because of, I'm sure you guys are aware of the idea of the selfish gene, and both direct fitness, so me taking care of myself and reproducing, but also my indirect fitness, so my kin's children, my nieces, my nephews, etc. So morality, in my opinion, sort of sprouts from these really basal rules of social cohesion that comes with living in more than just family subgroups. And I think it's fascinating to kind of look into that and think, okay, well, where do you draw the point? At which hominid ancestor does it become more than just wrong on an instinctual level? You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's what a lot of us like to know.
Yeah, I would like to know that as well. Unfortunately, it's quite difficult because, we're talking the last common ancestor we shared with chimpanzees, or genus span in general, is probably Sahelanthropus chadensis, which is, depending on who you talk to, like
7
7
million
to
years
10.
ago.
Yeah, 7 to 10, depending. I think the jury's still out. I was taught 7, but I did read a paper the other day that was kind of suggesting that we move it back a bit. So I don't know. You would imagine that it would have to come. I mean, we always talk about in evolution concepts of emergence. So it's not like a light switch, right? It's not like you don't have concept of morality for the sake of morality, and then all of a sudden you do. It's sort of a gradient, right? This level of awareness. I think we give consciousness too much credit as sort of a all or nothing type situation,
Seems that would you say
yeah,
that?
I agree.
Go ahead.
I would think, I would say that, so basically what you're getting at is that morality would be more of a byproduct of our social cohesion.
100%, yes. If we're looking at this from a naturalistic point of view, it's not hard to see how that would come about. We see so many different kinds of societies in primates, and we do call them societies. The general concept is hierarchies and how hierarchies fit into societies, and they're all, by and large, they share a lot of similarities, but also many of them are different, and they're different in odd and strange ways, and often it has to do with sort of quirks of social living. So it isn't difficult to see how these basic concepts that we see in all cultures: don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, right? And don't murder. You know, those 4 key traits are pretty much universal across most cultures.
Well, but murder's a legal term.
Right, killing then.
Yeah.
To kill.
Yeah, because I mean, technically, two gorillas could go at each other and kill each other, but we wouldn't necessarily call that murder because that's more of a legalistic concept.
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that's a good point, because you could argue that in a primate society, stealing is what's going to get you in trouble more often as far as the social group goes. You know, primates are capable of lying, and they frequently do so in order to steal. Vervet monkeys are an excellent example. They're a ground monkey that lives in most of Africa. They're known for having bright blue genitals. So if you look up a picture of them, you'll see that and you'll be like, what is going on here? But they're very cheeky little guys. One of my colleagues is actually going to study them for her master's thesis down in South Africa. And the cool thing about them is that they were, I believe, one of the first species that we kind of studied in depth, this idea of like predator calling. So basically they have specific alarm calls for specific predators, and then a co-call with that to say, okay, where's the predator coming from? So I might say leopard call from the ground, and then everybody knows to get up in the trees. Well, sometimes juveniles will make predator calls when they're at feeding sites, so that everyone goes up into the trees, and then they have access to the cream of the crop, so to speak. So they're lying, right, to get an upper hand, to have an advantage. But if they do that too often, everyone catches on, and it becomes a boy who cried wolf type situation. And sometimes your older, your adults will come and then beat up on this guy once they realize kind of what he's up to. So do they understand that this is wrong, or are they just reacting to basically a negative impact that they're receiving? You know, I would say the latter, but once you progress through this idea of what we consider to be a fully consciousness or an awareness of self, and sort of in primatology, they call it a theory of mind. So can I understand what you understand? Sort of an idea of empathy. Then that becomes far more, because it's not just, oh, that's hurting me. You have the concept of being like, oh, wait, that hurts the whole group. You know, it's sort of this idea of setting yourself apart and thinking of the unit, if you get what I'm saying.
Sure.
Yeah. By the way, I love the shirt. I was always a fan of the X-Files.
Thank you. I love the X-Files. I think, you know, we actually just had a debate with a couple of my friends the other day. We were trying to decide what was better, David Duchovny in the X-Files or in Californication. I said it's a no-brainer. It's the X-Files. You can't be Fox Mulder.
You ever notice that funded jellicles and their anti-theist counterparts usually have this X-Files view of biblical inspiration?
It's pretty wild. The X-Files is awesome. I'm actually due for a rewatch, but I think they took it off. I don't think it's on Netflix here in the UK, which sucks. And then I'm probably gonna have a hard time getting hold of it in Malaysia as well.
There's a lot of stuff you can't get on Netflix.
Yeah, unfortunately, but there are other means. I would not, of course.
Thankfully, you can get Twin Peaks on Netflix.
Yeah, Twin Peaks is cool as well.
Well, as long as you get BoJack Horseman, that's always a good thing.
That's true. I actually haven't seen the most recent season. I'm nervous. I'm scared for BoJack. He's had a rough go of it.
Oh yeah, I've become I just got into it and I just binge watched it and I liked it.
I think it's an interesting kind of. I think it's a really good take on mental illness. Honestly, I think that very few shows, are, especially lighthearted shows like that, are kind of, they appear to be lighthearted, are brave enough to tackle that theme. At least.
Well, I mean, I think it's more of like a mock, like it's sort of like a telling of Hollywood life and how there's this common perception that, well, if you're rich, you're in movies, you have all this fame, you're just this happy person, you have everything. And it's sort of challenging that point of view by showing, well, no, you have people that pretty much have all this success, but yet aren't happy.
Yeah. It's you know, very sobering. It's a sobering look at the entire situation. So I'm nervous. I hope he ends up all right. I think the season that I don't want to spoil it for anybody who might be listening, but the last season that I'd watched ended on a bit of a cliffhanger that was kind of hopeful. But BoJack has a way of undoing those small successes in favor of monster-sized mistakes on the part of Bojack.
Yeah. So
Speaking-
I've actually watched a little bit of interviews and discussions that you've had before online, and I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe you have said in other interviews that you were a former young Earth creationist yourself.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, sorry for that.
Yeah,
But,
I know.
But so, like, how did you get into that? Like, what got you out of that? Tell you a little bit of your backstory.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's kind of your typical, growing up in sort of that evangelical mindset sob story.
And also, what are your current beliefs now? Like, are you Christian, deist, agnostic, atheist, or?
Yeah, I will get to that because I'm in somewhat of a weird place as of now. I'm kind of trying to sort myself out. But I think that's not a bad place to be necessarily. It's sort of like I'll get to it in a sec. Anyways, yeah, I grew up young Earth creationist. My parents are both Christian, but they're both pretty chill Christians. I would put it that way. The young
In other
Earth.
words, normal kind.
Oh, pardon me. Sorry.
In other words, the normal kind.
Yeah, the normal kind, right. And so it was kind of incidental that I ended up in a young Earth situation because they essentially sent me to a Christian school as a child. And then, of course, for middle school as well. So, up until I guess what would be like 14. And they were kind of, it was very low on their sort of priority list that, my mom was a journalist or is a journalist. And then my dad is, he's a radiologist. So he's a very specialized physician. So both of them were kind of like, it wasn't really on the forefront of their mind that evolution and the age of the earth and these kinds of things are so frequently done dirty in sort of evangelical educations, I'll say. So they sent me to a Christian middle school. I lived in Indiana at the time, so pretty Midwest, pretty classic area for these things to kind of bluster and bloom. And I've said this in previous sort of conversations about the subject, but we had a specific class that started once I was in 6th grade. You obviously, if you guys know anything about Christian schools, they usually have a Bible class. And they called this class worldviews. A very, very sneaky way of basically saying, we're going to tell you why we're right and why everyone else is wrong. And they went about through all of the quote unquote worldviews, and these worldviews would be like nihilism, existentialism, naturalism, et cetera, and then they would use those sort of segues, like, okay, today, this for the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about what humanism is, and then they would use that as an opportunity to sort of other everyone who wasn't sort of an evangelical Christian and kind of dig into that. So naturalism, when we were studying naturalism, this was their opportunity to sort of do this takedown of evolutionary theory at the age of the earth. And I just have this distinct memory of eating it up, because I loved dinosaurs as a kid. And this involved conversations about, you guys know the classic, dinosaurs lived with humanity and they walked side by side, and we know that because of the I think it's the Paluxy footprints and Loch Ness monster and who knows, the Mokele Membe out in Africa, and no one knows that dinosaurs aren't still around. And
Technically they are.
Yeah,
if
yeah,
you count
exactly.
birds.
No, right, not avians. Yeah, not avians. And I was so taken in kind of by that idea that I was like, this is really cool. This is cool stuff. And I've said this before, but I have a distinct memory of them being like, yeah, the transitional fossil that they need the most is Homo habilis, and they've never found one. And I was like, okay, well then who do these guys think they are, going around and saying that they've got this transitional species, the missing link, so to speak, which of course we know there is no missing link. It's all a gradient, but that's how they play it out, because really and truly, the teacher who taught this wasn't a bad guy. I don't think he was a bad guy. I think he was just as misled as everyone else. And he was so confident standing up. He was our science teacher. We all trusted him. And that's the problem when you get into these private school situations where you don't have any kind of general standards, because people who don't know what they're talking about are in charge of a room of kids. and they can just tell them whatever they want, and the kids listen, and then they can get a grade on it. We had exams. I still have some of them back in the States, like in some cabinet somewhere of the exams. And I have an essay that I wrote titled "Why Evolution is False." I have an essay titled that. That is pinned to my name. Of course, I was like, 13, but still, it's very embarrassing. It's a blemish on my entire existence. And so when I went back and read it, and when I was, as an adult, of course, there's so much misinformation in there that it kind of jogs my memory. But because this was a private school, they needed to use, I believe this is kind of how it went. They used regular, kind of typical government textbooks for that age range. So we had normal public school textbooks. They weren't like passing around Panda's Thumb or something like that. So when I went home, I remember kind of leafing through it, and it was like, oh, this is the section on evolution. It's like, oh, the forbidden fruit. I was like, I'm going to investigate this and see just how, they basically root out why these guys are such liars. And I distinctly remember turning to the page first on human evolution and seeing the pictures of the skulls, seeing the pictures of the hominids, and seeing them with, in all their glory right there, not, a mystery. There, it wasn't, they did the classic, there are so few of them, you can't even make a straight line through with a lineage, but there it was in living color, all of it right there. And no one talked about it. No one told us about it. There was Homo habilis, several specimens at that time, and even more now. And they tracked how the change occurred. They covered genetics. They covered, morphology and sort of all of kind of getting into that. And at that point, I was like, okay, hold on a second. But this can't occur unless there's a lot of time. So then you leaf backwards and you go to let's talk about Age of the Earth, which of course in most textbooks is right before the evolution section. And you read that and it's like, oh my God, it's all there. A clear, beautiful transition that's for the most part uninterrupted, in sort of the grand scheme of things from, your first single cellular life up until now. And I was like, okay, but how do they know that it's that old? Because, they give you that Noah's Ark kind of garbage for hydrologic sorting and why the fossils are ordered the way they are. It's all baloney. And I was like, oh my God, radiometric dating, it's just physics. It's math. And then I kind of started thinking, and I was like, this is very strange to me that they just didn't teach us. Is it possible they don't know? Or is it possible that they do, but they don't want me to know? So I went to my dad with it, and I explained it all to him, and he was like, oh, I had no idea that that's kind of what they were teaching. He was too busy with doctor stuff, but he was kind of like, look, obviously this stuff is pretty legit. He's like, but that doesn't mean that necessarily that a deity isn't involved. He was like, you can have sort of this evolutionary creationism, I believe is what they're calling it today. No problem.
Theistic evolution.
Yeah, theistic evolution, right. And so that's what I held to for a very, very long time. After that was actually one of the things that spurred me to say, all right, get me out of this school. I need to go to a public school. Like, I want to have the actual education that I need to prepare me for college. So they took me out and put me in a public school, and I got a legit education. My public school was actually pretty good. And then after that, I went to college, et cetera, kind of segueing into what I said earlier about getting into kind of evolution at large, human evolution more specifically, and these kinds of things. Because the thing is that it's like these guys thrive on misinformation. They thrive. You guys have seen all the Kent Hovind debates where he goes on and on about how he understands the law of monophyly and then proceeds to demonstrate just how he doesn't know what it is. And doesn't get a gradient and doesn't understand, how phylogeny actually works and how lineages are structured. He calls it lines on paper and then dismisses it. He calls fossils bones in the dirt and then dismisses them. So then all you're left with is analogies, and then he's got the people in the room eating it up. It's very sad, honestly.
I find
well, I mean, don't you know that evolution requires that you believe that a pine tree will give birth to an elephant?
That pine trees and whales are related?
How a dog giving birth to a non-dog? They're not giving birth to anybody.
It's still a bacteria. It's still a fly. Yeah, Kent, We know. I don't know how many times he's got to be told that. And the thing is Kent was perfectly pleasant with me. He was, albeit maybe a bit condescending at times, but whatever. I don't really care. He was pleasant with me. And I tend to be less on the conflict oriented side. So I was kind of just taking the route of like, all right, let's talk it out. My favorite part of that was, all right, where do you draw the line between paternity tests and the genetics between humans and other species? And why do you draw the line? And I say this every time I have this conversation with people because I cannot believe still to this day that it actually happened. The fourth time I re-asked the question, he brings up the movie The Green Mile by Stephen King. What does The Green Mile have to do with any of this?
I mean, it's a good movie, but so is talk about Goodfellas or Casino or any other good movie from the 90s. Just
yeah, you can pick any of them. The Green Mile is quite good. It is a good movie. I watched it the other day, and I was actually saying to my boyfriend while we were watching, I was like, hey, you remember that time that I debated Ken Hovind? He's like, yeah. I was like, you remember this part? You remember this part? And I was like, that's the screen grab he used in his slideshow.
Would you say that it was better than Shawshank Redemption?
Pardon me?
Would you say it was better than Shawshank?
Probably not, because The Shawshank Redemption is actually my favorite movie. So it's very difficult for me to say that, because I don't know. The Shawshank Redemption, it has a special place in my heart. I don't know if I could say that it's objectively better or worse, because I'm not a film critic, but I can say I prefer The Shawshank Redemption just because it's less of a bummer.
I prefer Goodfellas.
Well, that, and I would also say I don't believe you're an aesthetic objectivist.
The aesthetic.
Well, that's actually a position in philosophy.
If you're gonna bring up a religious allegory film, why not bring up The Truman Show?
Fair, right? Yeah, and I think I don't know.
Even has the firmament type of dome and everything.
Oh, very true. Yeah, rakia, solid dome.
Well, I mean, I've always said, if you always wanted to watch a show that's basically what young Earth creationists believe, just watch the Flintstones.
The Flintstones, right? Exactly.
I've always said that's probably the best show for fundamentalists, because they sort of view it as a documentary.
It really is, and I mean, the Flintstones is actually a much less, kind of dread-filled world anyways, because no one is wiping anybody off the face of the planet. Or completely, what is it? They're not like crusades, but like the sort of wars that Israel had with like Babylon or Assyria or whatever, where they just completely obliterate every single one. Yeah. And it's like on command by God too. And you're kind of like, this sounds a bit like people using God to justify doing terrible things. Actually, which is kind of, which is not great.
You'll find Bill and Ted to be more educational than anything fundamentalists have to offer.
Oh, I 100% agree with you. You'll find most things. You can read the back of a shampoo bottle, and that's going to tell you more. It's.
I always. Oh wait, you go.
Speaking of sensation, I remember you discussing with that idiot standing for truth the so-called human footprints found in Crete that were said to be much older than humans actually lived in Greece, which is 270,000 years at the most.
Listen, don't get me started on the Trachylos prints. I made a whole 40-minute video addressing it, because the thing is that I don't know if you followed that whole thing, but those Trachylos prints, I remembered having a conversation with an old young Earth creationist coworker of mine. We worked in the same vet clinic, and we had a conversation about those prints. And we specifically, when we were looking at them, we were looking at the main three, the three best preserved, which, mind you, are three different sizes and have very shallow depths, not like what you see at Laetoli, where they're full footprints where you can actually measure how the organism that made them bore its weight while it was walking. That's not what we're looking at Trachylos. Trachylos or Trachylos, I'm actually not sure how you say it. I've been saying Trachylos, but whatever. Anyways, so then we honed in on one of those three, because I was like, look, these three prints aren't made by the same thing, so pick one. So we ended up talking about one. So in my conversation with Standing for Truth, I was like, yeah, there's like one print. I'd remembered the one, but he is right. There are more than one at the site, which I totally messed up and is my fault. But everything else he said about those prints was not correct. And I covered that in both in person and later in a video, kind of addressing all of those specific points. There is nothing about those prints. But this is all you need to know. The guy who discovered them and said that they were possible Miocene hominin prints, he is typically doing dinosaur trackways. That's Yerlinsky. That's the guy's name. He does dino trackways. The people who wrote the subsequent paper that was like comments on the possible hominin footprints, which everyone wonders, the question is, all right, well, why is no one talking about them? Well, 2 anthropologists did. One was an expert on foot morphology of hominids, and the other one was an expert on primate locomotion. So you can't have 2 more specific people on the job. And these are guys that have published dozens upon dozens of papers in their respective fields. Sarmiento works on living primates, and then Meldrum works on extinct primates, hominids. And they tore those prints to shreds, from everything from depth, like I said, how the weight pattern is born, to the lack of the midfoot ridge that Laetoli has, the fact that they are jumbled, all different sizes. There is no means by which to tell where one print ends and where one begins as far as what quote unquote individual made them. And the fact that, let's say too, even if they truly are footprints, which is what Meldrum and Sarmiento were like, these are not of organic origin. What's probably going on is you've got some weird sedimentary erosion going on, which I can kind of see. They do look rather footprint-like, but only superficially. Once you get up close to them, not so. Anyways, they were like, let's say, for instance, that they are footprints. Well, the Miocene, the area Crete and the Miocene was covered with apes. There were apes everywhere. And in addition to that, it was I think it's called the Messinian recession, whatever. The Mediterranean Sea was basically drying up. So the distance, this is just for your enjoyment, the distance between where Sahelanthropus chadensis, who would have been quite basal to this 5.4 or so million year trackway, quote unquote, in Crete, they lived in Chad, right? Sahelanthropus chadensis. The distance from Sahelanthropus walking up, across the dried out Mediterranean up to make those prints in Crete versus the distance that Anamensis would have to go to then derive into Africanus in South Africa, it's entirely doable. So we're not talking like, even if these are prints, that it would be impossible. Oh no, they're modern human prints, and that's, that proves that humans lived with the ancient hominids at the same time. Not even close. Plus, if you watch my video on that, there's some good graphics kind of near the end if you just want to skip to the end there, and it looks quite a bit, if you kind of if you're being honest with yourself, it looks quite a bit like bear prints, the 4 paws of bears.
Well, we did live alongside Homo erectus for a time until the Toba eruption.
Oh, not just Homo erectus. They call it the Middle Earth hypothesis because we lived with Erectus, Floresiensis, Heidelbergensis, Neanderthalensis, and Naledi. I mean, we're talking World War. We're talking about Lord of the Rings type shit here. Oh, sorry. Should I not? I probably shouldn't swear, right?
Go ahead.
Oh, it's fine. We say a lot of words.
No punches.
Okay, cool. Yeah, it's really, really awesome and interesting. I mean, hominids overlapped constantly because that's how evolution works. It's not like one thing turns into something else and then the previous lineage is gone. That's why we have chimps and bonobos and not just one or the other.
And our common ancestor with the chimps and bonobos, the so-called missing links, would be Sahelanthropus, right?
Currently, that is what the literature is leaning towards. Now, if theoretically, you could potentially find something a bit more basal. The reason I say that is because at present, it's believed that Sahelanthropus diverged into our lineage and then the genus Pan lineages. Yeah. But Sahelanthropus actually shares a lot of traits with us that chimps don't have, like reduced canines, right? Which suggests that potentially there was some pair bonding monogamy stuff going on. Because when you see those big ass canines in a lot of primates, it's usually because there's intermale competition. So which chimps are slightly dimorphic. But the thing is that they're less dimorphic than many primates. Females, you don't want to be bitten by a female chimp either. Her canines are pretty big too.
I never really noticed the difference between Australopithecus afarensis and africanus.
What did you say?
I said I never really noticed the difference between Australopithecus africanus and afarensis.
Yeah, they're very similar. Mostly it's geography. You find afarensis in Eastern Africa, afarensis, and then you find africanus in South Africa, which is, kind of suggesting that there was this migration deal going on with at least a population of Anamensis. Now, the question is africanus derived from afarensis, or are both of them sort of similar to chimps and bonobos derived from Anamensis? Now, if you want to talk about like their actual physiology, there's some slight cranial differences, I believe. I think africanus has a larger brain case as well, which would suggest that it's a bit more derived than afarensis, and I think that's dated to a bit later. Let me double check that for you.
Oh yeah, we never got to where your theological positions are now.
Oh, right. Yeah, lately I've been oops, that's the wrong PowerPoint. Lately I've been in somewhat of a weird position, because typically I've kind of been of the school where it's like I would say I was a theistic evolutionist with certainty until about 2 or 3 years ago. And since then, I've been kind of in the middle, kind of wavering between sort of a deistic, almost agnostic position, and still into theistic evolution. My problems come from figuring out for myself precisely why, if we're taking the theistic evolution route, why Christianity over every other religion, and is there actually evidence to support it? I don't know.
It's not necessarily that. Various faiths and beliefs have some truth to them, I would say.
Oh yeah, yes, precisely, and especially when it comes to.
Oh, guess what? Nice deist power over here.
Oh, are you a deist?
Yes.
Oh, cool. Yeah, it's. I don't know. I mean, I think the situation is, you get into a lot of kind of weird philosophical metaphysics where it's like, okay, well, what comes before nothing? And it's like, well, there doesn't necessarily have to be something before nothing. Time isn't a thing until it is. And as someone who's involved fairly deeply in the sciences, my brain starts to fall apart when you're like, we don't know, and I think that it is sort of a God of the gaps fallacy that kind of keeps my theistic evolutionist side going.
Fun fact, the God of the gaps accusation was conceptualized by Christians as a warning against other Christians not to argue that way.
Oh, really? I actually didn't know that.
What's funny is that God of the gaps, or like I would also say, argument from silence. I think it's a variation of the argument from silence. It's only really a fallacy, I believe, if you're using it deductively, in order to posit something, like as a proof. However, like with an argument from silence, to be more correct, is like it's only a fallacy if you're not explaining, like, why would we expect that silence? It's like,
right.
If you can correctly explain why the silence matters, then it's not a fallacy.
Right.
Like,
right.
I like to give this example. If I said that there was an elephant in my backyard and it was it tore up my entire house, if you came to my house and you found that my house was in perfect shape, there was no tracks, and it doesn't look, and like no one could ever testify that there was an elephant actually in there. You pointing out that, well, we would expect, if the elephant was in your backyard, we would expect something. And the fact that we don't have something is good evidence that it wasn't not there.
Yeah.
So long story short, you're an agnostic deist.
So I would say that would define my position currently, yes. And I think the main reason for that has to do with just, I started to kind of take some time, and this is terrible, but it kind of read the Bible, I guess, and like look into some of the, to read some of the kind of actual literature behind that, specifically behind like what actual scholars say. Because you got guys like Ken Hovind that think that it's like you can read the King James Version and get the gist of it. Well, Not really. It wasn't written in English, you know. I mean, I think that there's a really cool theistic evolutionist author out there that put it quite well. His name is
Zygarde.
no. Sagart's cool. He's awesome. I like that guy. But
John
John Walton? Yes.
Yeah.
I love him too as well. Like he was actually on one of my favorite like YouTubers inspiring philosophy.
Oh yeah.
He was
Yes.
actually on there. I like him as well because he points out like how you can actually read Genesis in a functional sense.
And it makes sense is the interesting thing. So and so at that point I was reading John Walton and I was like, this makes sense. I can get behind this. This works with the reality that I live in. Because a lot of Christians, I guess, will accuse you of, if you're and this is if you're taking not a deistic side, but more specifically with Christianity, a lot of people will accuse you of sort of compromising, which is stupid. But it's like the fact of the matter is, if
Just
the book
follow the evidence.
yeah, if the book contradicts the reality that you live in in many places, then either it's wrong or you're interpreting it wrong. You know,
There's a there's a good system that Christians had throughout the Middle Ages that the Protestant world just forgot. There's the book of the Scriptures, which is the Bible, and the book of nature, which is revealed through science. And if one contradicts the other, then that means their interpretation is off.
Well, what's actually funny about it is that young Earth creationists seem to have this backwards history of it, where they say, "Oh, the church throughout all of its century was completely young Earth creationist oriented." I'm like, no, it wasn't.
yeah, it wasn't it 7-day Adventism, right?
Yep.
Yeah, pretty much.
And even in history, there's
I mean, you can find some church fathers that leaned sort of on a young Earth creationist perspective, but even they that held to that position, even they said it's not really a doctrinal issue.
Well, guys as early as church fathers as early as Origen or St. Augustine, mostly Origen, but a little bit St. Augustine, were kind of taking positions where they were like, look, the weird thing about Genesis is that it's written unlike any of the other books, because it kind of it's this weird hybrid of prose and poetry, which most of the other books aren't. In fact, I don't think any of them are a hybrid like that, except maybe Revelation.
Genesis 1 and 2 are polemics against the surrounding creation myths of the Near East, and not a direct scientific account.
It's the Babylonian captivity. That was my position.
And Egyptian.
Yes, and the Assyrians as well, I believe.
I always found that funny with atheists that actually go in there and say they are ripping off all these accounts. I'm like, have you ever considered the possibility they're satiring them?
Yeah, or even just it's sort of a bold reclamation. I mean, and the thing is too, Inspiring Philosophy had an interesting video. Did you see his one on were the early Israelites kind of polygamous? That was his question. Yeah. And sort of he takes the stance of what, at least what I understood from John Walton's work, which is that they were monolatrous. So they were like, sort of like, yeah, these other gods might exist, they might not, but ours does, and ours is in charge. And so those creation sort of reclamations were like, no, Marduk didn't do it, no, Baal didn't do it, Yahweh did it, right?
And there's that's also Michael Heiser's divine council worldview. Not his view, but what he relays, and we've had him on the show a few times.
Oh yeah, that's awesome.
Well, yeah, I mean, what's funny is like, well, you said polygamous. That would be like that's relationship.
Polytheism.
Sorry, polytheism. My bad.
Well, that went on as well, but still.
No, yeah, totally my mistake. I'm actually.
No. Well, what's funny about polygamy and stuff like that in the Bible is that. Like, I've actually studied this a bit because I was actually pretty interested in pair bonding and how humans really got into that. And it's actually pretty interesting when you know that even societies that were and still are polygamous and don't have any gripes about it, they tend to be more preferential based. And there is there's some evidence to say that, like, where the reason why, I'm trying to think how to word it correctly because I don't want to mess it up. But reason why that polygamy is not really like people see that polygamy is a very sexist sort of system because they say, well, you have this one man with this many women, and they'll say it's just all about the man's pleasure, which is not true. And actually, there's actually arguments that are made that polygamy is actually horrible for men.
So have you read Robert Wright's The Moral Animal by chance?
I think I've read an audiobook on it. I mean,
you should absolutely give that a read because that encompasses precisely what you're talking about. It covers a lot of, okay, so humans typically, right, like we live in sort of polygamous and pair bonded societies where frequently, at least up until quite recently, most societies allowed polygamy, but monogamy was the reigning sort of attitude. And this was because obviously if you're a male, you want to ensure that your children are yours. And if you're a female and you're living in the ancient world that is not hunter-gatherer in nature, you're probably going to want to solidify a male who's excellent at parenting in order to ensure your offspring's best chance at survival. So it's sort of like this pro and con scenario between the two.
I always say it's like a business deal in a way.
It can be, but the way that Robert Wright illustrates it, and I thought it was in an excellent fashion, because the way that he kind of lays it out is that he's like, all right, let's say you've got 100 women and 100 men, and everyone is paired with their equal directly across. So the 50th man gets the 50th woman, and they're all tied in fitness, their respective fitness, right? So they're on par with one another, evolutionarily speaking. If you have a polygamous society, right, then let's say male number 3 gets female number 3, obviously, but then he also decides, hey, I can take care of more than one female. I have a lot of resources. And so he's like, I'll go ahead and also take female number 9. And female number 9 is hype because she gets to be with a more fit male. She's getting something out of the deal too. With that, every female shifts up a peg. And so now every female is paired with a male who's slightly outside of their league, fitness-wise, which is excellent for their offspring. For males, one male is now mateless. That is bad news if you're a male. The last thing you want is to not leave any progeny, if you're talking strictly from a fitness standpoint. So you're right. I mean, from looking at that, the best case scenario, at least from the female point of view, is to have a society that is monogamous with allowances for polygamy.
Well, I mean, what's funny is like people always generally, they don't talk about the other way around where it's rare in societies where you have a woman with many husbands.
Polyandry, yes.
Yeah, that's actually more rare. We have fewer examples of that than the reverse, and there is actually, to me, reasons for that. Because, in my opinion, it's because, for one, it would also be because of the inheritance.
Right.
But it would also be because that if you're a woman, you have multiple different men like that in that sort of relationship. It would be harder to pin any one man for responsibility of the kid.
All right, well, I gotta leave in 10 minutes, so
yeah.
Oh, no.
Yeah, you can go on without me afterwards, but
anyway. In 10 minutes we'll be almost at the hour mark, so we'll be wrapping up anyway.
Right.
Yeah, sure.
Anyway, history is my wheelhouse, but you want to know something interesting I thought about the other day, or depressing,
yes.
However you want to look at it.
Either way.
Modern industrial society is a short amount of time compared to the whole 6,000 years of civilization, which is itself a short amount of time in humanity's some 100,000 year existence, which is a short amount of time in the 10 million year existence of hominids, which is itself a short time in the existence of creatures on Earth since the Cambrian explosion, which short time in planet Earth's existence, which is itself a short time in the existence of the universe. What do you feel?
That is true. It plunges me into an existential crisis that usually lasts for quite some time. And then the more I think about it, the more I'm like, all right, here I am, a gentle and modern primate. I live in one of the best time periods for a primate to live, especially if you're, a human primate to live. If you're every other primate, then you're not doing so hot right now. But one of the best times for humans to live and one of the best places in the world for humans to live, particularly as a female. That's really nice because I can pursue many of the things that perhaps I wouldn't have been able to pursue 200 years ago. And then I think, the process of dying might suck, but being dead isn't that bad. I've been not alive before. In fact, I was not alive for many billions of years, and it wasn't so bad. So I think about it from that perspective, and I think, well, if there's an afterlife deal going on, that's awesome. I will do my best, obviously, to be kind to those I meet, unless they give me reason to not be.
I think Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle had that in mind, where if there is an afterlife, which they believe there was, then hurrah, yay! Oh,
well, Socrates was sort of agnostic on it.
Yeah, and then the alternative was that if there is no if this life is all we have, then death is just an eternal good night's sleep.
Right, exactly, and I love sleeping. So
well, with Socrates, that was sort of, well, obviously Socrates we don't have anything Socrates wrote because Socrates didn't write anything. Which, but from what people tell us about Socrates is that a thought that came through his mind was that, like, trying to think of the wording, but like he was being brought to death for his crimes, and basically what they told him is like, well, what he was saying that he was thinking was that, trying to word it correctly. Oh yeah, that, well, there's two options really. Either there's going to be an afterlife, and I'll be sitting up there with the gods, mingling with, Achilles and all the rest.
Hercules
or any of the rest, or I'm not, and I'm just going to be dead, and then I'm relieved from the suffering I'm currently experiencing.
Yeah.
So Plato were more enthusiastic about it.
Yeah. I think too.
Plato was very enthusiastic.
Well, I mean,
Aristotle.
This is to also tie back to our claims about morality beforehand, because I mean, I sort of distinguish between, like, we have to always draw a line between how animals and stuff see morality, because we have to take, even with humans specifically, our moral views change like probably every 100 years, massively. And so if you can say like there's massive revolutions over just hundreds of years with humans, can you imagine millions?
It's quite interesting to sit and think for even just half a second how long humans have, just anatomically modern humans, let alone all the hominids, and let alone all the hominoids. We've, like you mentioned earlier, you've got 300,000 years of humans doing human shit, and you've got 6,000 years of recorded history. So the question is, what was going on? What incredible tales of valor and interest and intrigue went on during that time period? People tend to downplay how cool hunter-gatherers societies are, but I don't know if either of you guys have heard of the book Sapiens.
Yeah, I have. I just rented it the other day.
Oh yeah, sweet. So then the lie of the agricultural revolution, how basically it hosed everybody. Hunter-gathering was sweet. It was the way to be.
So you got 200,000 years of caveman life, and then 70,000 years of behaviorally modern humans.
Yeah. And which one, you could make an argument based on either the fitness of an ecosystem and say, well, agricultural society is terrible for our ecosystems, of course. You can make the argument for human fitness, in which case we're doing really well. We are very prosperous, and everything that that hitches their wagon to us is also doing really well. Dogs, cats, cattle, pigs, chickens.
Well, dogs is more debatable because the fact that we've been breeding them, like, they're actually de-evolving to some people.
So sad, I know. I think that breeding regulations certainly need to be stricter. For especially for like your short-faced brachycephalic dogs that they literally can't breathe. Mm-hmm. So sad.
Yeah, anyway, I actually have a little dog of my own that's actually an incest dog.
Mm-hmm. Poor pup.
Yeah, well, it's funny. What happened about it is that my best friend, who gave us the dog, she didn't know that what was happening and going on, and it turned out that the daughter, like the trying to think how to word. Oh yeah, the dog I have, its mother is also its sister.
Oh yeah, they do that sometimes.
So yeah, she didn't know that it was going on. It just sort of happened, and the dog got pregnant, and now that we have that dog.
Yeah, when you
I mean,
can't.
it's a healthy dog. The only thing that's wrong with it is it has like it's partially blind in one eye.
Yeah.
But
But
outside of that, it's perfectly a healthy dog.
the thing is that when you domesticate something, they lose a lot of those safeguards for incest. So like a lot of primates they're basically either an organism will one sex will stay in their natal group and the other one will leave. So in chimps, males stay in their natal group. So like all the boys in a troop are related. They're brothers and then sons and uncles and things like that. And the females might immigrate in from elsewhere.
Mhm.
Oh,
But
I gotta leave
It's
in
like,
some minutes.
another
But
thing I've always wanted to know, because I actually have noticed, like, when it came to negative attitudes towards same-sex mating habits.
before
Now, we first
before
know
that,
about same-sex. Well, I always like to know, biologists do distinguish between um, orientation and behavior. We even distinguish that among humans because we have this thing called prison gay. And you notice something like that with animals, like especially goats.
yeah, there are quite a few that will engage in sort of that kind of sort of homosexual behavior. Some, particularly birds, interestingly enough, are the ones that engage in homosexual pairings. And then sometimes, especially swans and geese, I don't know their actual scientific name. I'm hopeless with birds. But they sometimes, occasionally, the same sex couples will actually steal eggs from heterosexual couples and proceed to attempt to raise them themselves.
It's
I don't know what the success rate of
basically a
that
form
is.
of adoption.
Yeah, it is. Essentially, it is. Yeah.
anyway, you all can go on while I should be back in like 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
Well, it's almost at the hour, so I mean, we can wrap up now anyway.
I was gonna ask you about your mass extinction series.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently, trilobites, ammonites, and dinosaurs have managed to withstand more than one mass extinction. Like, how is that so? And what interesting things can be said about the first two species? And you said you're planning on doing that series. Like, tell us how it's going. Like, give
Oh,
us
it's
a
going
preview.
very, very well. I love. I'm reading a book right now. If you like mass extinctions, read Peter Brannon's The Ends of the World. I feature it in the background of most of those mass extinction videos because it's so good and it's very, very well written. Yeah, all of the mass extinctions that we have had on this planet are related in some way, either directly or indirectly, to the carbon cycle, the carbon silicate cycle, which is really bad news for anything that is made of carbon, essentially. If you breathe oxygen or you utilize CO2, it's bad news for you. So when you've got these organisms that are so prolific, like trilobites or like ammonites, or really a lot of those, like for instance, I covered in the Ordovician Chimeraceras, this cephalopod with a 20-foot long ice cream cone shaped shell that essentially just haunted the seas. I mean, these guys were enormous and powerful and incredible to see, I would imagine. But you can be as prolific as you want. You can be a hyper predator. You can be a generalist, which is really what you want to go for if you're going to hyper predate. But the second, if you're living in the ocean, the second the acidification changes, your pH, or the second that you get stratification with where the oxygen is in the water, you're hosed. Now, guys like Chimeraceras, the ammonites too, like you mentioned, these are organisms that move up and down in the water strata. So if you're an ammonite and you require moving in between the layers of the ocean in order to feed, whenever you do that, be you predator or filter feeder, any change in that ocean is going to screw you, which is why the ammonites survived so many different mass extinctions until the one that just really slammed the ocean. And I believe it's the Permian, which I haven't gotten to yet. I believe we saw ammonites in.
The same one that got rid of the dinosaurs.
Oh, that would be the Cretaceous. Yeah, so then you're dealing with essentially what that would be, if I remember correctly, is a combination between a mass impact event, which would chuck up, and interestingly enough, if that impact event in Chicxulub crater had hit a second earlier or a second later, it wouldn't have hit, I believe it's a sulfur bed in Chicxulub, sort of in that Central America. That's really bad because all that sulfur comes raining down from the sky and it ends up in the ocean. And that really screws up the acidification. At the same time, on the opposite side of the world, you've got the Deccan traps going off. Siberian traps going off. Now that's really bad too, because like I said, the carbon cycle is like the absolute key. If you've got warm tropical seas, like in the Cretaceous, where like you mentioned you've got these ominoids that are the size of my living room, bobbing around in the water. These guys use a lot of energy, right? They require a lot of sort of living matter in order to survive. The problem with that is the big organisms aren't the ones that are being killed outright when you've got this massive sort of depletion or a surplus of carbon due to weathering or erosion or volcanic eruption or whatever. What happens is your smaller organisms go first. And either they thrive, like your phytoplankton, they either thrive and then they have an algae bloom and then they suck all of the oxygen out, which kills the small fish, and then your big guys have nothing to eat, so then everything big dies. Or the opposite happens, where you suck all of the nutrients out of the water, essentially due usually to like ice ages or something like that. Phytoplankton dies, everything that eats them dies because there's nothing to eat, and then you get ecosystem collapse. So all of these cool enigmatic guys you're talking about, same thing with trilobites. Like I mentioned in the Ordovician extinction video, there's a 3-foot-long trilobite called Isotelix rex that just destroyed anything that it came across in the shallow seas. It was awesome. It would have been so cool to see. The problem is, in the Ordovician, you had what I was just talking about, where you get a sort of sapping of carbon, and so you get an ice age. And when you get an ice age, the ice caps get bigger. But when the ice caps get bigger, your shallow seas drop, and you completely choke out anything that's living in them. So you could have thrown a rock without hitting a trilobite, in the shallow seas of the Ordovician, but it didn't matter because there was nowhere for them to go when the sea levels dropped. So you've got ominoids, trilobites; those guys are both taken care of. Like you get a drop at the shallow seas kills off most of the trilobites, and then they get finished off in the Permian, I believe. Ammonites get finished off in the Cretaceous, I believe. Don't quote me on this. I'm more of a primate person. And then your dinosaurs, that it's a tale as old as time. And as soon as your enigmatic herbivores have nothing to eat, everything that eats them goes with them. And the interesting thing is people often ask, okay, well, why was it the mammals that made it? What made them so special? What made the birds so special? How were they able to withstand it? And the answer isn't that they withstood it. It's that enough of them withstood it. So any mammal that was around where the impact zone happened, even within hundreds of miles, is toast. Doesn't matter if it lives underground or not. Same thing with the traps. But you get that special sweet spot of a burrowing mammal that lives far enough away from the impact zone and from the traps that is able to go underground during those superheated days. And voila, you've got mammals persisting well after the extinction, especially if they're eating, things like grubs that they can forage for while they're underground. Birds, I don't know. I don't know enough about birds to know which ones made it and why they made it. I believe it was water-faring birds, it's kind of strange. I don't know why that would be. Anyways, that's what I know about those 3 extinctions in a long, drawn-out monologue.
Yeah. Well, we've come up on the hour mark, so I'm gonna end it here. It was nice actually talking to you. I want to know if you have any projects that you have coming up, and where can people meet you?
Find me on Twitter. My handle is Gutsick_Gibbon. That's GUTSICK, and then Gibbon, like the animal, because I love gibbons. Same thing on YouTube, Gutsick Gibbon. That's my deal. Upcoming projects. Since I'm going to be in Malaysia, I'm racking up a lot of videos to kind of auto-release while I'm gone, so my channel doesn't get deep sixed by the algorithm. So I'm doing Monkey Mondays. So every Monday you can come. Monkey is sort of just using colloquially because it sounds good, but also prosimians and of course the apes and things like that. So every Monday, come to my channel, check out. We're covering a primate. Should be really cool. As for other things, obviously, I'm hoping to have at least 2 extinction videos ready to go. So that would be the Permian and the Triassic, and hopefully a video on the New World primate evolution, as well as the lemur evolution, kind of in the same video, and then the Miocene apes for my human evolution series. And if I've got time, I'd love to sit down and talk shit about Genesis Apologetics, because I really don't like that organization.
Oh yeah, I mean, if we ever have time, I wouldn't mind like just completely just shitting all over Ken Ham and the answers in Genesis as well.
I'm always down for a session like that. Those guys drive me crazy. Mostly it's because I know they know better.
Yeah. All right. Well, it was nice talking to you.
Thank you for having me on. I'm sorry I warned you. I monologue. I get so excited about these topics I can't shut up. So
it's fun. It was actually very interesting. I learned a lot.
I'm glad. It's that's the goal.
Yeah. Well, I want everyone to know that, make sure to follow Erika on her Gutsick Gibbons Twitter and on her YouTube. And of course, this is Mr. Brass, and this is Purple Pill Philosophy and the Transitional Primates Podcast for this case. And I want to say thank you and goodbye.